Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
Hello everyone, I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Bob Willard from Sustainability Advantage in Canada. Welcome, Bob.
It's great to be here.
Okay, so Bob, can you tell us first of all a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and how you became involved in sustainable procurement?
Sure, it's been sort of a organic process because I had nothing to do with sustainability or procurement per se in my career in IBM Canada. I spent 34 years in IBM Canada. And in fact, I've got a slide here that I can walk you through to just show you how I got to where I am today from where I was about 30 years ago.
Yeah, please do.
Bob does use slides as part of this podcast, and you can view the video version through our website if you want to choose that, so you can see Bob's slides and get the full experience.
So way back in the 90s, there are three things that I'm trying to show here. One is that I was working for IBM Canada, and at that time I was responsible for what we call leadership development. So every year we put our executives through a leadership refresher course, and our managers as well. I was also getting involved with some concerns from local neighbors and so on. I was living in a town called Ajax at that point, and they were talking about putting a new water plant into a location that was, from our point of view, a little too close to the Pickering nuclear generation plant, which is one of the largest nuclear plants on the planet. And we were concerned that some of the radioactive tritium in the drinking water would come into our water supply. So we were trying to get them to move the water plant. So that was a little background activity. And at that time, I was also going through a master's of education. I had sworn off formal education after I got my bachelor's degree many, many years ago at McGill. But as part of my leadership development responsibilities, we were talking about learning organizations. And it turned out that the University of Toronto had a program on learning organizations. So I decided to get a master's of education using those courses. The reason there's a dotted line is in the middle of that time, I was transferred down to our corporate headquarters in New York and did leadership development with our more senior executives. And then I came back, and by that time I wasn't sure if I was going to finish it or not. But the activity in the Ajax water plant woke me up to issues that I frankly was clueless about. I really thought the people who were looking after us were looking after us, but it turned out they weren't doing quite the good job that I was hoping they would do. And I kind of woke up to the fact that, geez, there's some serious issues here that we need to get our heads around. So I finished off my master's degree with programs or courses from the environmental faculty at the University of Toronto. And that woke me up to some of the major issues that I was really not aware of, unconcerned about, and thought, wow, we got to fix these things. Because I have kids, I've got grandkids, and some of these issues like climate change are really kind of serious. So I decided to do a master's thesis on the business value, the business case for companies to get their act together and stop contributing to the problem and maybe contribute to the solutions. So it was sort of on the business case for sustainability. So that was quite a while ago. Then I retired, and then I don't golf, so I didn't know what to do with myself. So I thought, okay, I'll take my master's thesis and convert that into a book. So I did that, and the first book that I wrote was The Sustainability Advantage. It was based on my master's thesis and came along with some spreadsheets on how to calculate the bottom line benefit of being able to clean up your act, save some money on expenses and so on, and make more revenue. And then, although the business case I thought was pretty good, it doesn't seem to be getting quite the traction that I thought it would. So I wanted to do a doctorate to understand why more companies weren't engaged in this if it was such a good deal. So I did a doctorate on that, and the result of that was another one, which is called The Next Sustainability Wave, Building Boardroom Buy-in. And then I took a paper that I had written as part of my master's and converted that into a book as well, on how to lead change when you don't have a whole lot of position power, but you really care about this stuff, and how to make change happen in an organization. So those are my first three books, and kind of got me started on the speaker circuit as well, talking about those things. Then I wrote some more books. I did an update to the Sustainability Advantage, cleverly called the New Sustainability Advantage. So I recalibrated all of the numbers, which ended up being significantly better for the company if they engaged in sustainability initiatives. Helped develop the Future Fit Business Benchmark, which is currently led by the Future Fit Foundation in London, England. And it's a science-based framework for assessing how you're doing on all of the things that you need to pay attention to. This is how to justify a project. Wrote a couple of white papers, got a bunch of tools, a bunch of slides, do a lot of talks. And then basically I was producing all of this stuff for others to use, for others to read, for tools that others could use in their work with organizations, either public sector, private sector, academic, didn't matter, but save them reinventing the wheel and produce resources that might be helpful to them. My concern was that we weren't doing enough on climate change. So I thought, okay, I need to get my feet on the ground here and start doing something to address greenhouse gas emissions. So I ended up creating some tools associated with procurement, because I really think that procurement is an untapped market force that can engage businesses in paying attention to things that their customers think are important. And if their customers think that greenhouse gas reduction is important and they are accountable for the greenhouse gases that are coming from their supply chain, then it behooves the suppliers to reduce their greenhouse gases, especially if they get a lot of points for doing that. So, or paying attention to it in the bid appraisal. So that's how I am currently pretty focused on all of that. And to walk the talk on all of this, I decided that I wanted to reduce my own greenhouse gases. So there is a slide here that shows that I've done a lot of talks and a lot of interviews, over 1,700 talks and interviews over the last few years. And to walk the talk, I decided to get into net zero procurement. And this is a bunch of the activities that I've been working on. I'm on a couple of boards about that. I've created some ways to self-assess how the extent to which you are currently using sustainable procurement in your own organization, some toolkits to help you get there, and some other activities. One of the little things down here is that Canada has this net zero challenge, which is an opportunity for companies to commit to reducing their greenhouse gases in line with science-based targets. And I was creating a tool that I thought would be more appropriate for small and medium-sized enterprises to do that kind of self-assessment. So I wanted to see what questions they were asking. So I entered the Net Zero Challenge, frankly, just so I could get the questions. And it turned out that when I submitted my answers to them, I was at the diamond level, which is the highest achievement level. And the reason is that I had consciously and intentionally tried to walk the talk on all of this. So this is my net zero journey. Back around 2005, my total greenhouse gas emissions from, I'm a sole proprietor, so these are the ones associated with my business, were a little over 25 metric tons. Most of that was coming from flying. My scope 3 was my Achilles heel in all of this. Scope 1 was from driving. I had a hybrid car, but was still emitting some emissions. And scope 2 was pretty well flat because I was using what are called green natural gas RECs from a company called Bullfrog Power in Canada. So basically I'm using green natural gas for our heating and air conditioning. And then the scope 1 emissions I reduced to 0 when I got an electric vehicle. Scope 3 in 2019, I finally decided to stop flying, which for a guy that's on a speaker circuit, that's a significant change. But fortunately, around that time, COVID hit, and people got more acceptable to or accepting of having these kinds of talks. So it worked out fine. I'm still doing a lot of talks. and I've got my carbon footprint down to 0, and that's what I'm maintaining. So that's a little bit of my journey on what I'm up to and how I got here, and I'm having a good time. I really think that we're starting to get some traction, not nearly as much as we should or need, but we're starting to get some traction on these issues. A lot of the leadership's coming from Europe, frankly. The corporate sustainable development reporting, CSRD initiative in Europe is really a leading exercise. It's fantastic.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bob. That's a fascinating journey, and yeah, I think all of us at some point in time have that kind of light bulb moment that there's more to life than than doing what you do, and actually you can do things that make a difference. As I said, a lot of our people in our audience are procurement people. I'm sure they're going to be fascinated to hear more about your thoughts. Certainly, what I'm starting to see now, and probably have seen in the last couple of years, is there's a fast growing realization, exactly what you've said, that what, procurement as a profession holds the keys to an awful lot of these issues, because now we're starting to wake up to the idea that scope 3 is a real thing. Actually, procurement is in the spotlight then for delivering against those scope 3 emissions through the supply chain. How are you seeing that panning out in your world? Are people waking up to that idea, and are they acquiring the skills they need to do it?
Some have, but many haven't. It's really, as I said, it's really an untapped market for us. I don't think governments, let alone corporations, have understood the power of the purse, the capability that they have to engage businesses on topics that are important to them and encourage their suppliers to adopt their business models to be more responsible, more sustainable. I've been talking to the Canadian government, the procurement people at the federal level in Canada, about doing more on this. They agree in principle. It's just that they have other priorities, and the challenge is to try to get them to actually implement what I'm calling net zero procurement, which is not only paying attention to the attributes of the goods and services that you're acquiring, but the attributes of the supplier as a company, and encourage them to pay more attention to greenhouse gases, commit to reducing them in line with science-based targets, and actually take action to make that happen. I think part of the reason that I am so convinced of this being a powerful market force is that for years, when I was in IBM, I was in marketing, and I was on the supplier side of the equation. So I would get a request for a proposal, an RFP, from large customers. For a while, I was stationed in Edmonton, Alberta, and I was selling to the Alberta government, not only to the government as a government, but also the school boards and the hospitals and all of the associated agencies that they were responsible for. And I remember getting an RFP from them where they asked a really unusual question. And it was, to what extent are you contributing to the economy of Alberta? I thought, what? That's got nothing to do with the system that you're asking us to make a proposal on. But there were a lot of points associated with that. So when you get an RFP, very often you see how much weight, how many points are associated with each of these specifications that they're asking for. And this one was worth about 13 points, which was a fair amount relative to the other weight for other specifications they were looking for. I thought, oh, geez, but that's a great question. So I put together the IBM in Alberta story, which was actually pretty darn good, much better than any of our competitors could have possibly done. But my point is, I would never have done that if the customer had not asked me to do it.
When was this?
Well, this was 1981.
Wow.
It was just a wake-up call to me as to the power that the customer has if they opt to use it to engage suppliers in undertakings that they otherwise would not have thought of doing.
Yeah.
So I really am convinced that if governments, especially governments that have committed through the various COPs that are going on, Conference of the Parties that are going on, to reduce their greenhouse gases, they can't make that happen unless the companies in their jurisdictions do a similar kind of thing. So the buying power of governments on all of this, I think, is really, really significant and totally underused.
It is, isn't it? And I guess I find that in different parts of the world, procurement is seen slightly differently. And I think you mentioned earlier Europe being a little bit further ahead, probably quite a lot further ahead actually, with legislation like CSRD. When I've worked in North America, I've seen a difference in the way that procurement is seen compared maybe to Europe or Asia Pacific, where procurement has a lot more influence, whereas in some parts of the world it's seen as a very transactional thing.
It is, and best price is really what they're looking for, as opposed to best value. So the people who administer the procurement process, they're really good people, and they know how to wordsmith a document with all of the appropriate terms and conditions and so on in it. They're really good at administering the process, and they do whatever the user department or the client department is asking them to procure. So they're good at going out, finding the best solutions on the product side, and they are 90% focused on the product side, understandably, because that's what their client is looking for: a product, a good or service that's going to meet their requirements. They also pay a little lip service to the attributes of the supplier, the performance of the supplier, whether they're a good company, whether they've been around long enough to be able to count on, to be able to deliver what they said they're going to do, and so on. So the attributes of the supplier have not nearly been tapped as much as they could or should. So let me just show you a couple of slides relative to procurement that I think we need to tap into a little bit more. So I referred to scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions previously. It's pretty clear that most of the emissions that an organization is accountable for are scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and 2 are important, but in most cases, they're only about 10 to 20% of the emissions that the organization is accountable for. And more jurisdictions are making sure that the organization or the company is accountable for, mutually accountable for, what's happening upstream in their supply chain and downstream in their customer part of their organization, what happens at end of life. And this upstream part is where most of the emissions are coming from for most companies. So when organizations are now being held accountable for that and keeping track of it, which is driving them nuts, but that's what they're supposed to do, this means that they are more interested in reducing the greenhouse gases coming from those suppliers. So what net zero procurement does is it wakes up the supplier to the fact that this is an expectation that their customer has, and that they should be being more proactive on it. So my definition of net zero procurement is obtaining the best value for money by purchasing the most low carbon and circular goods and services from suppliers who are most committed to circularity and science-based net zero greenhouse gas reduction targets. And why are they doing that? Because it supports the buyers or the customer's purpose, policies, and strategic goals. If it's important to the customer, it's important to the supplier. So basically what we do is we make greenhouse gas reductions and circularity, and those two are joined at the hips, so that's why they're both there. Greenhouse gas reductions and circularity matter to suppliers because the scores on the supplier commitment to circularity and to science-based net zero targets are significantly weighted, 10 to 30% of the points associated with the bid in their customer's bid appraisal. In other words, we make it matter. We don't just ask about it, but we make it count. If you don't make it count, they're going to blow it off. But we have to make it count. And the power of the bid appraisal in all of this is really, really important. So I think we've got an opportunity to help organizations implement this as a starter set for a more comprehensive, sustainable procurement approach. Start with the carbon stuff and then get into water and the other social things as well. But this sets up the pins. So I've got a little toolkit that helps companies do that. It's free, it's open source. And it basically has 4 components that are add-ons to whatever they're already doing. So sample specifications for product low carbon and circularity specs. They've already got some specifications, I'm sure, for products. Just add these onto them in the RFP. Supplier assessment tool, a little tool that assesses how committed they are to net zero targets and to circular design. I'm sure they're asking other questions about the supplier as well. Just add these questions in there. The bid appraisal template, I'm sure they already have one. I'm just suggesting that they have a line item at least for these 2 things and that they weight them heavily enough to matter. And sample terms and conditions to make sure whatever commitments they made when they were being assessed, they follow through on. So, and there again, there are always terms and conditions associated with the contract. These are just more. So what we're trying to do is to build on, not throw out, build on their current processes. They get really twitchy if they think that we are implying that what they're doing now is not correct. What they're doing now is fantastic. We just want to make it more fantastic and add some tools to it. So I'm really trying to get the feds and others to do that. And I think if we can mobilize net zero procurement to the various levels of government in Canada as well as other jurisdictions and have a ripple effect through the private sector, we've got a fighting chance of being able to do what needs to be done to fix the climate crisis in time.
I really, really love this, Bob, because I mean, you and I met, I guess, maybe a couple of years ago, and we've been developing the same sort of thinking in parallel on other sides of the Atlantic. And I love the concept that you come across there. It's what I call sustainable supply and sustainable supplier. And they're different things. And I think your slide has encapsulated that really nicely, because it's all about buying the lowest carbon goods and services from suppliers who are committed to a low carbon agenda. And for me, it's very dangerous to do one of those things. And what tends to happen, certainly in my world of procurement, is there's a lot of focus on sustainable supplier, and then you can get sort of unintended consequences. I remember working a long time ago now, I think 2008, when Marks and Spencer in the UK were first developing their Plan A, and they wanted some advice on appointing architects, and it's, well, you know, what do we need to do with architects? And I said, well, what about staff transport? Have you got staff transport? Does that, are you counting that in your supply chain? Well, no, we're not. So why are you asking your architects questions about the sustainability practice of their business when they're not going to make any difference to your carbon footprint? What you need is architects who are able to design energy efficient buildings for you. And your secondary consideration is whether they drive around in little, gee whiz electric cars as they were at the time, or, if they recycle their pencils or whatever.
Right.
Those 2 commitments are important, but in some cases, some are more important than others. And I do see a lot of practice and a lot of platforms out there that collect a lot of data about the supplier, but don't actually focus on the supply. And I really love that slide of yours, because it says actually what you need to do is both.
Absolutely, we have to. And the self-assessment tool that I helped this organization called Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, SPLC in the States, they have this assessment tool called a Navigator. And what it does is it asks them the extent to which they are doing both of those things, asking about the specifications of the goods and services, the supply, as well as the performance, sustainability performance of the supplier, and the extent also to which they are assigning significant weight to both of those things in the bid appraisal. Because if you ask about them, but you don't make it matter, then you're just going to tick off the supplier and waste an opportunity here to engage them in something that perhaps they otherwise wouldn't be inclined to do. So I really think that this dual requirement in sustainable procurement is really important, looking at both the supply, as you expressed it, as well as the supplier.
Yeah, that's, yeah, as you say, definitely preaching to the converted here. It's the other thing that I do see as well when I look at procurement. I look at procurement as an activity, and weighting factors are, are associated with bids in the supply. I see suppliers then that are very good at writing all the words into the tenders. In some cases, they employ consultants to write the tender, and then when they win the project, they sack the consultant, and they never actually do what they said they were going to do in the first place. And the customer never follows up because for me, there's more to sustainable procurement than putting some weighting in a tender. Because suppliers, as you know, will promise you the moon on a stick when they tender, and then as soon as they get the project, unless somebody does something different, they'll carry on doing what they did before.
Yeah, so the SPLC Navigator asks about that kind of follow-up, and the toolkit also has terms and conditions that you put in that make it very clear that there are penalties and maybe bonuses, but penalties if they do not follow through on whatever they said they were going to do. Some of those could be financial penalties, there could be other kinds of penalties. But we need to make sure there are some teeth in this, that we're serious about it, that we're not screwing around, and that there is a very clear indication that this is not a game. This is something that is serious, and we're going to make sure that the supplier follows through appropriately on whatever commitments they made.
I think it's interesting as well, and just picking up some of the threads of things that you've presented to us. When we think about scope 3, I have a quite recent example in the UK with a customer that I won't name that was using within the supply chain school in the UK. We have something called the carbon calculator, which again, like a lot of your tools, is free of charge and available for anybody to use. Then what happens then is partners in our supply chain school can buy into the data, because an organization can measure its carbon footprint properly, real data, real carbon, and then they can allocate that carbon to their customers based on the turnover of the organization. So it's not a finance-based carbon calculation, it's a real carbon calculation, and then they can apportion it based on carbon. We have a client that is going to stop using that tool because it's not giving them the answer that they want. They found now they're collecting real data from their suppliers, and they're actually recording their electricity, their gas, their vehicle miles in exactly the same way as you described for your own personal business. It's not giving them the answer they want. So they're going back now to using a financial based calculation, because actually that gives them a better answer. And I don't know whether that, I suspect that might be a trend going forward, because I think the world is going to be shocked when they really look at scope 3 and understand the size and shape of it. And sadly, I think, there are some less than scrupulous board members out there that are going to say, oh, you know what it's like. You've worked in big business for a long time. You give the board of directors an answer, and if it's not the answer that they want, they tell you to go away and find another answer.
Right.
Is that? Are you seeing that? How are you seeing the whole kind of integrity of really addressing scope 3?
Well, it's a huge issue, not only for scope 3, but for any of the sustainability reports that we are provided with by companies. The real question is, are these certified? Are these verified by third parties? So can we trust them? Because the greenwashing that's been going on for years is pretty prevalent. So in the little tool that I've got, which asks them how committed they are to reducing their greenhouse gases in line with science-based targets, there are 3 little hints about the fact that they shouldn't be messing around with the answers. The first thing is, in the profile at the front, when they fill out who they are and their name and their contact information, it also asks them for the name of the officer, hopefully the CFO or somebody on the board, who has verified the integrity of their answers in the following questionnaire. So that's the first clue that this is for real. The second thing is, in several of the questions, there's an opportunity for them to identify where there is a publicly available evidence that their answer is correct. And the third thing is, when there's a total score at the end, because it gives them a percent score as to how they're doing on all of this, if it's not verified, there is a 10% subtraction from that score. But if it is verified, then the score is what it is. So that's 3 indications, as well as in the terms and conditions of the contract in that little toolkit, there is a requirement for them to make sure that their questionnaire was verified by a third party. And if the answer is more than 10% deviation from their original answer, then they lose the bid. So we need more of those kinds of teeth in this, because the inclination to exaggerate the truth in their answers is something that we need to discourage.
Yeah, and then I guess, obviously, the detractors from this type of approach, and I'm not one of them, so I'm playing devil's advocate, will say as soon as you start to get into this third-party verification, you're adding quite a significant cost to your supply chain.
Yes, and that's true. The question is, who's going to pay the cost? Is it going to be the buyer, or is it going to be the supplier? And as you know, EcoVadis is in the business of doing these kinds of assessments, and they're pretty pricey. So if people can afford EcoVadis, then they can afford because by definition, that's third-party verification of the answers. Then I really think that the buyer should do that, or the supplier should add the cost of the verification to their price. But somebody's got to pay for it.
Ultimately, it's going to be the customer will pay. I mean, however the money's transacted through the value chain, eventually the customer's going to pay one way or another.
If the customer is the government, I think the government should pay. If the customer is a corporation, I'm not sure. It depends.
Well, thanks very much, Bob. That was a fascinating insight to your long career and your background and how you became involved in sustainability as a topic. This is part 1 of 2 of our podcast series with Bob. We look forward to part 2, where Bob talks a little more about the history and best practice in sustainable procurement. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.